Many users interacting online are content to stay within the confines of their familiar social networks, which may not look so different from their real-world social networks. Let it be known that I consume a lot of YouTube. A lot. I wake up and check my YouTube feed, watch YouTube videos while I'm doing chores or in the shower, and tend to fall asleep with a video playing in the background. As a creator, I'm also on the lookout for channels similar to mine to make sure that I don't overlap topics with something already created. As a result, I'm on here so much. A little while ago, I discovered something on my YouTube dashboard that gave me pause. On YouTube's homepage, underneath the search bar and above the video feed, there is a list of categories. This list of categories identifies topics that you might be interested in, things like true crime or mukbang. In this list of video topics that I can choose from, one inevitably gets listed right near the top, that being Black women. For some reason, YouTube presents Black women as a topic of interest to me, despite the fact that I am not a Black woman. And ever since I noticed that, I've been wondering, what's up with that? Now, I consume content from creators of many different demographics, including Black women. Off the top of my head, I can think of 4 channels that I watch consistently, that being For Harriet, Kimberly Nicole Foster, Cat Black, and O Stefco. And while the 3 creators behind these 4 channels are indeed all Black women, I find it odd that YouTube is creating Black women as a category to describe the content of all these channels when these creators put more on display than just Black women's issues. For Harriet describes itself as a Black feminist community but posts many types of social commentary. Kimberly Nicole Foster posts and streams a lot of media reviews and also current events related content. Cat Black covers topics ranging from movie deep dives to TikTok reactions to polyamory confessionals, and O Stefco does what I would describe as a mixture of vlogging and commentary. Interestingly, commentary is not presented as a blanket category, even though the majority of other channels I watch, creators like Kayla Says, Matt Bernstein, and Khadijah Imbo do exactly that. My question is, does a platform like YouTube have access to this demographic data to the extent that it leverages identity-based vectors in order to recommend content? Or is the algorithm analyzing that content enough to know what demographics will be most likely to consume it? Now, this question is not exclusive to YouTube. The implications of this question affect pretty much any website that uses an algorithm to target advertising. And the answer is likely quite complex to the extent that I, as a person who doesn't have a good grip on the back end of the algorithm, probably can't determine what's really going on. I do wonder, though, what the larger implications are around an algorithm designed by humans with biases that takes a source's racial category and encodes further information based on that. Now, if you've been on the internet, you know that we always have conversations about polarization in society, specifically about polarization along political lines. Those on the right accuse those on the left of existing in a digital echo chamber, and vice versa. There's a related debate that's been floating around intermittently, that being the push for racial diversity and diverse representation in media. In my mind, this hits its first peak in 2012 with the premiere of the HBO series Girls. Writing for The Independent, Catherine Scott hit at Girls creator Lena Dunham for portraying a friend group of 4 white women in a New York City that is, in reality, heavily diverse. Quote, "What's there to celebrate for feminism when Black, Hispanic, or Asian women are totally written out of a series that's supposedly set in one of the most diverse cities on Earth?" In recent times, perhaps due to the release of Dunham's new show Too Much, we've seen some alternate perspectives on this point of criticism. Recently, Substack user Amber J. Phillips posted this note. While Lena Dunham was getting slammed on blogs for writing an almost completely white world in New York, I knew from personal experience that white people, no matter how potentially diverse their surroundings were, would go out of their way to create white utopias for themselves in real life. What was rare was someone willing to tell the truth about those worlds and how white women temporarily fare within them before completely falling to the constant threat of duress due to the oppressive, inescapable reach of white patriarchy. I've never needed Lena to write Black people. What she is able to do with a TV show is much more entertaining. So yes, the initial criticism of Girls was that it depicted a sort of racial echo chamber and that perhaps was irresponsible. What Phillips was saying, in contrast, was that this is not altogether a dishonest portrayal of the racial homogeneity that pervades American society today. When it comes to echo chambers of any sort, we ought to think about the possibility that any sort of homogeneity comes with a predictable set of drawbacks. These drawbacks can potentially affect how people socialize within digital and IRL spaces all the same. Specifically in this video, I want to pose this question. With the advent of targeted advertising, is the US American internet getting more racially siloed? Are we reaching a point of de facto segregation in how users of different races experience the internet? Before I even begin to unpack this question, I must state a few caveats. The first is that the internet of today does not look like the internet of 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 30 years ago. In an ideal world, the internet serves as a tool for democratization of ideas, so that people can be exposed to narratives that aren't necessarily widely circulated where they physically live. What we see in practice now is obviously not that. But I want to keep these utopian ideals in mind as we enter this discussion. We should keep in mind the transformative potential of the internet in achieving what we might call a better world. To give a personal example, I grew up in New Jersey. The majority of music that I listened to growing up was the predictable kinds of hip hop, pop, and dance music that they played on the radio and at block parties. But through the internet and the blogosphere of the late 2000s, I was able to get exposed to a variety of genres I otherwise wouldn't. Things like disco house, J-pop, and New Orleans bounce music, to name a few. Having exposure to this array of music genres from an early age completely influenced the music writing I did as a young adult and the content that I make now. I consider this to be a net positive. At the same time, I want to acknowledge the inequitable flow of information that the contemporary internet has enabled. I think it would be incredibly naive not to mention how Black creators have seen their content and intellectual property claimed anew and diffused out to white audiences without receiving their due credit. This goes beyond things like slang and TikTok dances. Memes and references which once would have cozily resided within the context of Black Twitter now are able to reach other demographics at lightning speed, which typically results in these memes and references being misunderstood and even co-opted. I think in these circumstances, the desire to gatekeep is completely understandable. In that sense, gatekeeping and homogeneity somewhat go hand in hand. To have this discussion, and especially to invoke the notion of segregation, we ought to clarify some terminology. Now, it would be very tempting to refer to what I'm talking about with the shorthand of, quote, digital segregation. However, this metaphor is a little insensitive to the reality of what racial segregation was in the postbellum United States through to the desegregation movement. I think bandying about the word segregation is irresponsible unless the conditions are really being met. That being said, some analysts have already used the turn of phrase digital segregation to mean something else, that being disparities faced by people who do not have a cell phone, smartphone, or reliable internet access. For both those reasons, I will not be using that turn of phrase in this video. Another turn of phrase to introduce into this discussion is similar but distinct, that being, quote, digital redlining. The American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU, defines this term thus: the use of technology to perpetuate discrimination. In using this definition, the ACLU cites the 2019 case Vargas et al. V. Facebook Inc., filed in the United States District Court for the Northern District of California. The details of this case were profiled in an article by Salon. The lawsuit demonstrated that Facebook's user interface enabled landlords to discriminatorily show or hide certain demographics in housing advertisements. While I think this is a very real problem and something that the law has to catch up to, I don't know if it can be extrapolated to the phenomenon we're describing here, which has to do more with socializing and content flows. In the social sciences, there is a word we can use to describe at least the basis of this phenomenon, that being homophily. In a sense, homophily means the pairing of one person of one demographic to other people in that same demographic. And this concept can pertain to any identity vector, such as boys tending to form relationships with other boys and girls with other girls, or persons from upper middle class backgrounds preferring to socialize with each other in spaces like country clubs and regattas. One seminal social sciences paper relevant to this conversation is Birds of a Feather: Homophily in Social Networks. This paper was published in the Annual Review of Sociology by authors Miller McPherson, Lynn Smith Loven, and James M. Cook. And this paper, published in 2001, examined homophily in American society by virtue of categories like sex and gender, age, religion, education level, and race/ethnicity. Taking all those categories into account, the paper concludes, in diverse societies, race and race-like ethnicity creates the most stark divides. So we can infer that this existing segmentation is the basis for any sort of digital homophily that may or may not be occurring on apps and websites. The notion of racial homophily was famously interrogated in another seminal work, that being Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And Other Conversations About Race by Beverly D. Tatum. Here is a quote from Chapter 5, Racial Identity in Adulthood. That life is stressful for Black students and other students of color on predominantly white campuses should not come as a surprise, but it often does. White students and faculty frequently underestimate the power and presence of the overt and covert manifestations of racism on campus, and students of color often come to predominantly white campuses expecting more civility than they find. Whether it is the loneliness of being routinely overlooked as a lab partner in science courses, the irritation of being continually asked by curious classmates about black hairstyles, the discomfort of being singled out by a professor to give the quote black perspective in class discussion, the pain of racist graffiti scrawled on dormitory room doors, the insult of racist jokes circulated through campus email, or the injury inflicted by racial epithets and sometimes beer bottles hurled from a passing car. Black students on predominantly white college campuses must cope with ongoing affronts to their racial identity. The desire to retreat to safe space is understandable. Sometimes that means leaving the campus altogether. Now, I want to zero in on what Tatum here calls safe space. Keep in mind that this book was published in 2003, before the notion of a safe space became popularized in the early 2010s and later weaponized in the late 2010s. If I had to pick this apart, I would describe the safe space Tatum describes not as a place without conflict where everyone is valid, but in fact a place where one can authentically be themselves without interrogation or concern. Because unfortunately, to be racialized as Black, Hispanic, Asian, or Indigenous in America means that you could face discrimination and othering at any time. Yes, even today. On that note, we can supplement what Tatum is saying with a quote from Miriam J.A. Chauncey's relevant work of literary criticism, Searching for Safe Spaces, Afro-Caribbean Women Writers in Exile. In the introduction, Chauncey writes, "My struggle to overcome adversity through education had two components. On a primary level, I was seeking to reach a site of safety from which to form my own ideas, and to stand my own ground without having to fight off every detractor. I was attempting to learn something about myself that could secure this site for me, and I did not realize for a very long time that I could not easily do so within the academy system I was struggling to master. In everything I was taught, I was moved farther and farther away from my origins. The more I advanced in school, the more I found that my personal and communal histories had been expunged from the official records. I did not exist, and furthermore, no one like me had ever existed before, or so I was led to believe." Let's apply this rationale to the internet. Without the internet, you might think you're the only Black girl into goth aesthetics, the only Pakistani boy who's a rail fan, or the only Indigenous person questioning their gender identity in their collective suburban hometown. In reality, you are geographically isolated, but not alone. The legacy of the internet of the 2000s into the 2010s should be that it connected peoples and subcultures in a positive and affirming manner. I would argue that Tumblr specifically achieved this aim in its heyday. That being said, Tumblr is actually at the center of this discussion. A recent post on Tumblr illuminated one facet of this story, which is how a user base can end up concentrated in one demographic direction. This post asserts the following: Tumblr banned large numbers of the prominent non-white, particularly Black accounts on Tumblr during the periods around 2016 and again in 2020. Lots of people claimed it was a purge of Russian bot accounts. But the fact of the matter is, before those ban waves, there were prominent non-white groupings regularly advocating racial justice. And now, this website is several times whiter than it was 10 years ago. And anytime it's brought up, a lot of those white people honestly believe all the banned minority accounts really were Russian bots. I've had white users on this site tell me people I knew IRL were actually Russian bots, because they would rather believe that than the fact that this site has racist moderation. Now, as a card-carrying Skeleton War survivor, I remember the 2016 purge quite vividly. I can co-sign what this user is saying in the sense that I saw this demographic shift take place, both from banned users themselves and from large swaths of users of color abandoning Tumblr as a result. Personally, I don't believe that there were Russian bots deployed to Tumblr, because seriously? Tumblr? But in a contemporary internet where so much content is not manually self-curated, but rather presented undemocratically in a gamified way, these kinds of conversations about who is in a bubble hold more and more weight. But I'd have trouble believing that this sort of self-curation is any more racially stratified on Tumblr than on any other platform, however. The major players on the internet are Alphabet, X, and Meta, with other platforms like Reddit, Tumblr, Blue Sky, and Substack all doing whatever it is that they do slightly more independently. While it's possible for an echo chamber to form pretty much anywhere, there is an aspect to which algorithm-driven content streams encourage their formation if the machine is rewarded by forming them. My Instagram, for example, knows that I'm looking for work, and as a result, my entire For You feed is a depressing echo chamber of drab job postings. In the past, it's looked very different, populated with things like micropoetry and ADHD infographics. Now, I know that I'm being tracked in many ways, and that is not surprising to me. Even at that, the algorithm is so locked locked in that I wonder and fear what it would be like if I were consuming things like manosphere content instead. Luckily, recent research published in Scientific Reports illuminates at least a few things to consider in asking this question of digital communities and homophily. This research was published under the title of Digital Inequality and Neighborhood Divides in Online Social Networks in Chicago on July 1st, 2025 by researcher Karl Wahuska. Wahuska is a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. In the scope of this paper, Wahuska mapped accounts on X, formerly Twitter, to physical addresses in the Chicago metro area. Using this dataset, the author overlaid demographic information according to the census tract associated with each address. After establishing the dataset, the author examined how tweets or messages shared to X could be, quote, segregated between neighborhoods across racial lines. In the discussion section of this paper, Wahuska states, "These findings reveal several ways that neighborhood and race stratify access to information. Contrary to certain popular thought, this research suggests that neighborhood inequalities are not alleviated by social media, but are reproduced differently. In particular, I found that users in Black and Hispanic neighborhoods are more marginalized in the network, tending to have fewer followers they can share information with, and tending to follow fewer accounts from which they can obtain information. Notably, the age distribution and socioeconomic composition of neighborhoods fail to explain this relationship. Furthermore, users tend to follow other users who reside in neighborhoods that are racially similar to their own, thus causing information to be racially insulated between different neighborhoods. Notably, differences in poverty between neighborhoods appear to be insignificant in predicting the existence of ties, further highlighting the importance of race in neighborhood social divisions. Educational and occupational differences between neighborhoods also fail to explain the effect of racial differences on neighborhood tie formation." If you didn't catch that, the gist of this study is that Chicago-based users of X, formerly Twitter, appear to experience a sort of digital homophily. Let me emphasize this quote in particular. Users tend to follow other users who reside in neighborhoods that are racially similar to their own. In essence, this potential echo chamber is not correlated to a neighborhood radius, but in fact composed of a Black or Hispanic user and their network across the city. Think of it like the subway, or in this case, the Chicago L. While people of all races and ethnicities do use the subway, the characteristics of who is in the train car will change throughout the route. But notably, the people who can afford to either take an Uber, drive their own car, or otherwise maneuver about the city independently are not represented in the users of the subway. This indicates to me that the influence of historical redlining and racial segregation in Chicago has its own digital afterlife. So it's important to consider that this is one study and one in an emerging research area at that. So there aren't a ton of other studies to which this can be compared. Also, this study exclusively analyzed data from X, formerly Twitter, which are not necessarily replicable to other proprietary apps like Facebook or Instagram. That said, according to Wahuska, Twitter users in Black and Hispanic neighborhoods were much less likely to follow the Chicago Department of Public Health and less likely to be exposed to the account's tweets through retweets. Importantly, I found that this disparity is almost entirely a result of these users following fewer accounts overall on Twitter. Thus, increasing their engagement on the platform may alleviate inequalities in access to information produced by such important accounts. This stood out to me in particular because it is indicative of what Black creators have repeatedly claimed over the years, that they tend to get less engagement compared to white creators in the same sectors. Now, important to mention here is the dichotomous nature of research regarding race and inequality. On the one hand, internet algorithms are proprietary software, like an opaque black box. Research in this vein may not be able to tap into exactly what the algorithm is doing. Researchers may not be scientifically capable of proving that racism, bias, or discrimination are outright causing a phenomenon. On the other hand, in the words of a tweet I saw in the late 2010s, we obviously know that racism existed before you could point to it on a pie chart. As further relevant research is taken up in the fields of digital and urban sociology, we'll have more to consider. An important question we could pose here is, rather than is the internet becoming more stratified, we can ask who profits from the internet becoming more stratified. This pointed question gets into a well-known concept in marketing known as market segmentation. Market segmentation, in plain terms, is identifying a set of demographics to which you might market your product or idea. Salesforce's online guide to marketing describes it thus. Marketing segmentation is when you divide a broader target market into smaller groups based on shared attributes. Segmentation enables you to better understand your diverse audience, tailor messages to specific segments' needs, and ultimately increase the effectiveness of your campaigns. It goes on to say, your work becomes tailoring your marketing efforts to specific sections with the goal of meeting the preferences of each group. The underlying idea here is that people belonging to different demographics will want different products. Perhaps the most insidious manifestation of market segmentation is your classic 90s fast food kids meal, which presented the food and beverage alongside the options of a quote girl toy or quote boy toy. This market segmentation assumes that the toy preferences of a girl child would differ from that of a boy child. And it very well may, if not for the fact that delineating those options with toys with wildly different characteristics is considered to reinforce oppressive gender roles. There is no biological reason why a girl couldn't play with a toy bulldozer or why a boy couldn't play with a plush kitty cat. Whether or not the manufacturers of these toys have overt sexist beliefs, their ultimate goal remains to sell twice as many toys by splitting the toy consumer market into boys versus girls. So imagine then the thought process behind targeting ads to different racial demographics. Keep in mind the goal of this is to maximize profit rather than tolerance and understanding. Now I can concede that there is an extent to which this makes business sense. A product such as curl cream for textured hair is logically going to be targeted at the group of people who are more likely to have that curl pattern, even though there are a non-zero number of white people who use brands like Aunt Jackie's and Shea Moisture. It would be relatively nonsensical to market this product to someone like me, for example, who is bald by choice. However, even in what we'd call analog or traditional advertisements, this is a very slippery slope. You could argue that a brand like McDonald's featuring black people in its TV commercial campaigns is a diversity win. Several commentators have pointed out, though, that this unfairly targets black consumers who are already more likely to consume fast food and potentially have adverse health effects as a result. For example, this excellent video by Yellow Cedar Nutrition, which I'll link in the description. Especially now in a time of more corporate deregulation and less oversight into public health outcomes, I think it's very important to be extremely critical of advertising as an arm of the glowing kleptocracy. That said, we return to this question of whether or not the US American internet is growing more racially siloed. The question of whether the demographic homophily, already entrenched by suburbanization and redlining, also translates to digital communities. And I think this question is really difficult to determine, not only in terms of metrics, but also in terms of what constitutes a digital community. Is a group of Twitter mutuals a community? Is a fandom Discord a community? Is a wistful subreddit like r/bald a community? I think in general we've lost the plot on what the word community means, but that's a topic for another video. Rather, in an internet ecosystem where we are being tracked and advertised to without interruption across basically every platform, I'd argue we are moving away from a singular experience of being on the internet. And yet, it's difficult to materially prove that internet users of different races have divergent experiences based on the internet itself bending around them. A more likely explanation is that the internet reflects established offline patterns. As NPR put it in an article from the Ancient Before Times of 2011, quote, "Many users interacting online are content to stay within the confines of their familiar social networks, which may not look so different from their real-world social networks." And yet, I suspect there's more going on behind the curtain than we know, because the amount of data being brokered at any given moment is far more vast than we can really fathom. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Alright folks, that's the video. Thanks again for making it this far. Do you feel that your IRL community differs from your online community in terms of demographics like race? Let me know that in the comments as well. This is Hassan with the Diaspora Gothic channel. Remember to stay connected, stay rooted, and stay dramatic. Bye!